Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Chris Roman, professor of oceanography at the University of Rhode Island. Professor Roman, thank you for joining me.
No problem.
As we know, on Thursday, the Coast Guard confirmed that after a massive search, the missing submersible voyaging to the Titanic Wreckage imploded and killed all passengers aboard. Before we really get into it, can you discuss the types of resources that went into trying to track this vessel?
Yeah, so this is, I would say, was a completely sort of unprecedented response. So very quickly, the Coast Guard and the Navy and first responders from several different countries mobilized a lot of assets to a place 400 miles south of St. John, Newfoundland, which is pretty impressive. And so a lot of resources were brought into bear. Surface ships, airplanes, and some deep sea technology such as remotely operated vehicles. Right, so these are tethered systems that can look around on the seafloor, and that ultimately is what was used to confirm the debris from the submarine.
Like you said, a lot of resources were brought in to try to track this vessel, but reports indicate that the Navy believed it heard the sub implosion hours after it first went down on Sunday. So, when you hear that, what do you make of this massive search and rescue that was launched?
I think it was still very reasonable. I mean, you have, well, I guess you'd start. There's a lot of things in the ocean that can make sounds, right? Sperm whales, biologics, fish, mechanical things, ships, right? And so if you hear something like that, now you have to make a decision. If this is, how conclusive is that? If there's any doubt in your mind that there could still be people stuck in a vessel, on the seafloor, I think you're pretty committed to try and find them within a reasonable time window of survivability. I think that's sort of generally how this played out, right? Through the people like myself and others who sort of know the ins and outs of these systems have been thinking all week about what could have gone wrong, what redundancies didn't work, what systems were in play. The unfortunate answer, the simple answer, was that a catastrophic implosion was the one thing that explains everything. And so we really didn't want to have to immediately jump to that conclusion. And, we do want to hold out hope. And if there's any possibility at all, it does seem reasonable that those assets, were mobilized to try and perform a rescue, if at all possible.
You're an expert in this area, so I really want to dive into what you just said. The catastrophic implosion has been described as to what happened. So, what specifically does that mean? I mean, can you break that down for us? How far did that sub get before it imploded? What happened here?
Well, so the difference between implosion and explosion, just to be clear. So we think of a rocket blowing up, right, as an explosion. So that means all the potential energy in rocket fuel is inside that rocket. It wants to get out. We're talking about the opposite scenario here. So the submarine is a pressure vessel. So it's this chamber that's trying to make a nice 1 atmosphere volume inside of it. The ocean is the potential energy that wants to get in there, right? And it wants to do so sort of desperately. So any flaw or design issue or any little imperfection in that pressure vessel creates a structural failure. The ocean is going to get in there in a hurry. And this is a high energy event. And so it's over in an instant, a millisecond probably. At the pressures they were talking about, I think they were saying they were probably 3/4 of the way down to the seafloor. So that's still pretty deep. That's round numbers, 3,000 meters. That's a lot of pressure on a pressure vessel. So that's what we know, and that's sort of what seems to be consistent with the debris they found on the seafloor.
This story obviously has garnered international attention, and something that was going massively viral on social media was the fact that this vessel was operated by what was a Game Boy like controller. Is that a normal way for to run these types of vessels?
So honestly, that one particular thing doesn't bother me. To operate any of these vessels, you need a way to convert, joystick commands from a person into a computer. That's what video game controllers are. That's what they do, right? And they were designed for a target audience of teenagers to abuse them. So a lot of engineering actually is going into that video game controller. Personally, Could I design something that does that? Sure. But the number of engineering hours that went into that video game controller is probably way more than I would ever put into designing a similar thing. So the video game controller aspect didn't really bother me. The question is, other systems on the sub now in a sort of a post analysis, there's going to be very detailed analysis of what happened here. So I don't want to cast blame because I don't really know the details of this particular submarine, but the post analysis is going to go through very, very specific engineering details of this submarine. And the company that built it and operated it is going to have to provide answers for a lot of questions. And so that's where this sort of analysis would come from. But knee-jerk reactions about a video game controller, I think, are not actually helpful at this point.
I do want to talk about what did bother you. Another clip that has gone viral is OceanGate's CEO saying this back in 2021. Quote, "I'd like to be remembered as an innovator." And he also said, quote, "I've broken some rules to make this. I think I've broken them with logic and good engineering behind me. The carbon fiber titanium, there's a rule you don't do that. Well, I did." When you hear that, does that bother you?
Well, it's obviously cause for concern given that we've now had a major failure. So I think it should be noted that the industry that does this deep submergence, we've sent people in submarines, and we send hundreds of people a year to the deep ocean in submarines. The community knows how to do this safely, right? There have been no failures up to this point. So the design standards and best practices exist, right? So that's on the table, and that's very much true and intact. This particular design was out of the norm. So now in a post-analysis, there's going to be questions asked of how much engineering was done and was anything, clearly wrong with the design such that it's violating some of the sort of fundamental principles of, what happened here. I think, in terms of innovation, I don't think it's crazy to try and innovate. In fact, that's great. But you have to do it with, obeying some of the best practices. And for this particular instance, this is not an unmanned system, right? This is manned. So now the bar is that much higher, to protect human life and do your due diligence. The questions are going to be how much was done and what background can this company now provide to say that, yes, this was done soundly. With respect to carbon fiber, it's a non-traditional material. It behaves, a little bit more. It's different than sort of your conventional metals, titanium and steel that these vessels were made out of. That's not to say it's impossible to work with, but again, it sort of means you're going to have to do more homework to work with it. Now that we've had a failure, we know that something was, amiss or not quite right. And so that's what's going to come out of this in the end.
As we begin this post-analysis here, what procedures or practices do you think need to be put in place so this really never happens again?
Well, again, up to this point, we've had a perfect track record in deep submergence. And so because the community is full of a lot of diligent, thoughtful engineers who take safety very seriously. For example, the U.S. Science Fleet operates the deep submergence vehicle Alvin, which is a Navy certified asset. So every 3 years, Alvin goes through a deep, investigation and recertification. So there is a process there that we know about. The question is, for things like this adventure tourism market, or people acting in international waters, or private companies, can that same level of rigor be applied or should be applied through proper regulation? That's, I think, where this is going to lead.
This voyage was going down to explore the wreckage of the Titanic, so I'm curious, it imploded as it was going down. Is there any indication that this implosion could have impacted that wreckage at all?
I don't think so. I think my understanding, it was about a half mile away, which is pretty consistent with where you would expect the sub to come down if you released it above the Titanic and you would factor in some ocean current. So it's my understanding from listening to the Coast Guard briefing, it was a reasonable distance away from the Titanic, and it's not, and there was no actually Titanic debris in that area. So, not having been there myself, I'll take their word for it, and that sounds very reasonable to me.
You're an oceanographer, and I'm curious, what precedent does this set for deep sea exploring? You said this was an unprecedented event.
Well, I think there's a few things that are going to come out of this. One will be the sort of regulation that we just talked about, and what design standards are going to have to be followed for these sort of non-governmental private subs. So that's definitely going to come out of this. And then there's sort of the whole adventure tourism concept to begin with. And so I look at that as potentially a double-edged sword, but it's not all positive. It's not all negative. We look at the lore of the Titanic and the interest it's generated in the popular, culture. It's been actually great, right? Oceanography has benefited from the Titanic. That was the original idea behind Bob Ballard's exploration of the Titanic. It generates fundamental interest in the ocean, which ultimately, I hope personally, leads to ocean science. That's great. The Titanic is also, a graveyard, and it's bigger culturally than any small number of individuals who want to visit it. So that has to be respected. I can see a business model where you bring private capital, right? So private funds, not governmental, into exploration through things like adventure tourism. That would be great, right? As long as I would like to see a direct path between some of those funds going into education, technology development that benefits more than just those few private individuals with those funds. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. And do you think that this is going to deter adventure tourism at all?
Human nature is a funny thing, right? I mean, how many people have died on Mount Everest and how many people are in line to go, right? And so, in some ways, this should not necessarily be that same thing because we know how to do this safely. The question is, are we willing and able to, one, put the regulatory constraints there, and two, can we develop or will someone develop a business model that seems to sort of hit on some of the points I made earlier where, there's enough private capital that can fund the expedition, but it also sort of obeys some, I think, pretty fundamental rules about sacred sort of, cultural places like the Titanic, and it also benefits the community at large. So it's not just, sort of small number of private individuals sort of exploiting what could be sort of, more cultural community asset.
Professor Chris Roman, I appreciate you coming on and joining me today.
No problem. Thank you.